of the southern sort of subtropical, tropical transition area there of Mexico. So that's where that catbird needs to get going. I don't know exactly what their whole wintering range is, but they're very abundant there.
Yeah, I better get on it. It's probably not happy with the weather now.
No. No, I don't think of them at all as feeder birds. I don't know what they would eat. Maybe a little bit of that fruit, or maybe he's just going after insects and stuff. And
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I've had one in my yard for the past couple of summers, so I don't know if it's one that's just hanging on late that's been in the area, or but like I said, I haven't seen it in probably 2 or 3 months.
mm-hmm.
Well, we're supposed to get some snow flurries tomorrow, so that might motivate him.
Yes. Yeah, it's motivating me. I guess I'll say.
Well, should we get started?
Yeah, the Facebook feed appears to be working.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. And we're really privileged to have Dr. David Flaspohler presenting tonight and pulling a lot of great information together. David grew up in Southwest Lower Michigan, where his family frequently visited the Kalamazoo Bird Sanctuary and Nature Center. He's a lifelong birder, member of the Copper Country Audubon chapter, and has been a professor of avian ecology and conservation at Michigan Tech since 1998. He earned his MS and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he studied the influence of forest clear-cuts on the nesting success of migratory birds. At MTU, he teaches ornithology and field ornithology and does research in the Great Lakes region, as well as Hawaii, Latin America, and New Zealand. He just created a new 2-credit online course, Introduction to Bird Watching, which he offered for the second time in the spring of which will be offered for the second time in the spring of 2021. So thank you for being with us, Dr. Flaspohler, and take it away.
Great. Thank you for that that nice introduction. And I'm really excited to be here and have a chance to talk about UP bird populations, to the chapter with the best name for any Audubon chapter probably in North America. I always loved that laughing whitefish ever since I first saw that when I first was in the UP. So that's a great chapter. And I'm on the board of the Copper Country Audubon chapter here. So it would be great to see more sort of collaboration and communication between our two chapters, because I think we're doing a lot of the same things and loving a lot of the same things. So what I've done today is I was asked if I could summarize some information on changes in bird populations in the kind of the Houghton Keweenaw geographic area. But of course, from a bird standpoint, most of what I'm going to talk about can probably be generalized to the Western Upper Peninsula and certainly to the Marquette region. But I would be really interested, and I've had some time in the beginning and at the end to sort of query you folks about what your perceptions of changes in bird populations are from just anecdotal experience, or even some of you may be citizen scientists or do your own bird monitoring. So let me just start. So just what I want to cover tonight is talk a little bit about what kinds of things influence populations of birds. How do we actually learn about bird population status in a kind of scientific, systematic way? And then I'll present some findings from different sources. One of them is Laurie Binford's book on the birds of the Keweenaw, and focus a little bit down on what birds have increased, what birds have decreased in historic times in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And I want to make clear right at the beginning, this isn't an exhaustive list of every bird species that's gone up or gone down or remained stable. We don't have time for that. So I've kind of just looked for some of the highlights and some of the clearer examples where we can look at those kind of changes. So as I said at the beginning, what I wanted to do is just sort of ask the audience here, what's your sense of bird species that have changed in abundance in your lifetime, in your in the time that you've lived in the Upper Peninsula? This could be things that seem more abundant now. And somebody already mentioned northern cardinals, and they certainly are more abundant in the UP than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And they weren't even in much of the lower peninsula. If you go back to the 1930s and 1940s, they were a rare bird in the southern third of the lower peninsula even. And so they've been sort of marching northward for many decades. But I just wanted to ask the audience to think about species that they've noticed changes in. So please share those right now, and then I'll show you some examples and we'll talk about some of the reasons behind some of those changes.
We've seen fewer nighthawks over the years.
Somebody says fewer nighthawks, is that
Right. Right.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that because that whole group of insect gleaners, aerial insectivores, have suffered quite a lot. Broad population declines among that whole group, including nighthawks and whippoorwills and swallows. Yeah, so if you've noticed that, it's probably real because there's some empirical data to support it. And then who was it? Someone was going to say something else, I think.
Well, maybe I'll jump in, David. This is not specific to the UP, but certainly the numbers of bald eagles have greatly increased over the past 40 to 50 years, I would say.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that one in some detail. So yeah, certainly bald eagles in my lifetime have gone from fairly rare in the Great Lakes to quite common.
David, over on Facebook, Lori wanted to know about red-bellied woodpecker population changes.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I don't have anything really definitive on that. Red-bellied woodpeckers seem to be one of these kind of low density UP birds. And I don't know if they're actually increasing or if they just seem to sort of persist as sort of this rare but regular southern woodpecker. I've only seen one in 21 years here in the Keweenaw, and that doesn't really tell me anything necessarily. But there's people get them on a regular basis. Maybe one more.
My husband says that we used to have tons of black-throated greens in our yard, nesting and singing and everything, and all of a sudden, none. And he asks, could that be a result of a nearby clear cut?
So sort of a noticeable decline in the black-throated green warblers.
Yes.
As related to a clear cut. Well, certainly black-throated green warblers like relatively mature forests with kind of a mixture of conifers and deciduous. If the forest right where you're noticing they're less abundant was not disturbed, and it's a large piece of forest, then I wouldn't think you would see a nearby clear cut having a big effect. But if the overall amount of forest right in that region declined quite a bit, meaning whatever patch you're seeing them in or we're seeing them in is still intact, but but the overall amount has declined, you could, I think something like that could have an impact on black-throated green warblers. Well, so I think the you guys are all here because you're interested in birds and you pay attention to birds, and there's often it's sort of anecdotes sometimes that will pique our curiosity, and then what we hope is that there's some sort of systematic regular monitoring program that will allow us to sort of turn that anecdote into data that we can reliably look at for changes, for real changes. And this is a slide showing you some years of Canadian bird populations kind of broken down into groups of birds, either by taxonomic separation or by birds that are associated with certain kinds of habitats like wetlands or forests. And I'll show you this similar data here for United States birds in the United States, but I think the bottom line here is that the trajectory of birds is complicated, that not all birds are declining. Some birds are really suffering clearly right now in the last decades. Like we mentioned, someone mentioned nighthawks, and you see the lavender line at the bottom, aerial insectivores down almost 60%, grassland birds down really precipitously. But other birds seem to be increasing, and many species are relatively stable, at least in these Canadian data. So trying to understand these trends is a challenge because of the diversity of birds and the diversity of habitats birds occupy. And then it's really made more difficult because most of our birds here that are here in the summer are migratory. So they're experiencing many different habitats and different forces that can impact their population. So where we look to understand real changes in bird populations are standard repeated surveys, like the US Census that is going on right now for human populations. The breeding bird survey is perhaps one of the more famous ones, and it focuses on birds during the breeding season, and it began in the mid-1960s. Some of you may participate in that, or the Christmas bird count, which is another count that goes back to the turn of the century and focuses on wintering birds. So it gives us a different snapshot of bird populations at a different time of year. And then there are a lot of focused, more targeted surveys on waterfowl. There are some nocturnal bird surveys that go on that target birds that aren't well surveyed during the day, owls and some of the nightjars. eBird is this tremendous new tool that allows millions of citizen scientists to share their observations, and that provides at least the raw data that can be used to monitor bird populations in many cases. Probably, I'd be surprised maybe if there's anybody in this audience who hasn't participated or used eBird in some manner. Is that correct? Anybody here who hasn't? Wave your hand. Okay, there's somebody. I'm not looking at all of you, so I can only see a group. Yeah, so eBird, if you just Google eBird, you'll find a website that allows you to view data on your local bird populations and bird diversity in your area. If you happen to be traveling, which nobody is anymore, but if someday you happen to travel to Florida and you want to go and see what rare birds or common birds have been seen around Fort Myers, in the week before you go there, you can go to eBird and learn that, and you can report birds that you see. So that's a great tool, and I would encourage all of you to investigate that. And then there are backyard bird counts, Project Feeder Watch that Cornell University, a lab of ornithology organizes. So there's all these different surveys that go on out there, and that's really what I'm going to talk about, a lot of the results from these, because these are some of the best data that we have for monitoring bird populations. And I just want to start with one species to kind of give you an example of changes in a bird population and the kind of things that went into our understanding of it. And that's the peregrine falcon. And this is a top predator bird. You have peregrines nesting in the Marquette area, I'm sure. On buildings or power plants or something. Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a second. But the things that you really, that make peregrine falcons unique and some of the key parts of their sort of life history and demography that made them sort of relatively easy to notice when a population went down, and then also made them kind of relatively vulnerable to population decline was, well, they're a top predator, so they environmental toxins that they encounter tend to be bioconcentrated in their tissues. They're nest site limited, so but prior to people putting out nest boxes, they needed cliff sites, and suitable cliffs just aren't available in that many places, particularly in the Midwest. The Eastern North America population in the late 30s was estimated to be about 350 pairs across the whole half a continent. And by 1964, there were no peregrines left in Eastern North America. So what happened? That's a pretty dramatic loss, population decline to zero for that part of North America. Now, peregrine falcons are found all over the world, different subspecies of peregrine falcons. So the species wasn't disappearing, but it was declining very quickly in Eastern North America. And because they're sort of relatively large and conspicuous and fairly easy to identify, they were being monitored at various hawk migration sites in Eastern North America. So that was one advantage that biologists and citizen scientists were able to document this loss. But in the years after World War II, when this was happening, biologists were wondering if it was poaching, if there was something related to habitat loss or changes on the wintering grounds. And it was really looking at a regular hawk migration monitoring site in Pennsylvania, in Hawk Mountain, and a few other sites like that around the world, where people were able to document changes in populations like you see here. You can see from 1965 through the 80s and then beyond, this dramatic drop in the number of peregrine falcons that they were counting. And the lower left is a picture of Hawk Mountain. So this is a little bit like Brockway Mountain, perhaps here in the Keweenaw, where we do raptor migration monitoring every spring. And if you're interested in that, you can go to the Brockway Mountain Hawk Watch site. But it was really this sort of regular monitoring that gave one of the pieces of evidence that peregrines were declining. And then as people began to look at the biology of peregrines and the reproductive biology in particular, there was a connection discovered between the introduction of DDT, which was a pesticide that was deployed after World War II, and the reproductive success of peregrine falcons. And in the US, DDT was banned in the early 70s, and you can see there was a bit of a lag, and then the population seemed to sort of climb back up. The other thing that was kind of interesting about the DDT story is that there was a pastime, kind of a science and kind of a recreation for, especially in Europe, but also in North America, called oology. And this was the collection of eggs, bird eggs, sometimes for scientific purposes and sometimes just simply for the aesthetic pleasure of bird egg collecting. And because this practice had been going on so long, there was this long record of eggs for many different species that you could go back and look at characteristics of those eggs. And this is some data that goes back to the 1870s on the thickness of Eurasian sparrowhawks, this accipiter relative of our sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawk. And you can see you can see sort of a range of eggshell thicknesses here in these old eggs that were collected. But what you can see here that is important is that when DDT was introduced, the eggshell thickness dropped. And that was really that was what began to clue biologists into the connection between DDT and the reproductive failure among a whole series of raptors, peregrine falcons, sparrowhawks, bald eagles, and many other top predators that were, they weren't necessarily dying from DDT poisoning, but they couldn't reproduce. And so once the adults perished, there were no young to replace the adults. So this is some photos and a couple graphs showing you the recovery of the peregrine falcon population, and it recovered largely through a reintroduction effort where peregrines from other parts of the world that were healthier were brought to Eastern North America. Nest boxes were put out to increase the carrying capacity of the landscape for peregrines. And here you can see the state distribution in counties. And this isn't complete because it doesn't show Houghton County, which has I think two nests or three, and there's a couple in the Keweenaw County. You see there's a nest on Isle Royal. There is also red. And so the bottom line is that through the efforts of population monitoring, the decline was detected, and then through a lot of efforts through the reintroduction program, the population in Eastern North America has recovered, and it was delisted in 1999. And let me see if I can shrink this down, but there's some photos of our own local peregrine pair that have nested on the Houghton Lift Bridge for the last 6 or 8 years, and 4 young that were produced just this year. So that's, the peregrine falcon is really one of these success stories, conservation success story among birds, but it really documents, it includes a complete population collapse to 0, and then a recovery of that population.
David, could I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
If you could go back to your last slide,
Yeah.
do you happen to know for these county records that are shown on the map,
Yeah.
are those due, or to what extent are those records due to artificial nest sites?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the Lower Peninsula, they're almost all artificial nest sites.
Mhm.
I don't know if if anybody's there and happens to know, but I know Grand Rapids was a big, one of the earliest places they tried to reintroduce peregrines and hack them out, which is what they call it when they introduce young ones, and try to get them to imprint on a new nest site on power plants and tall buildings. There were some in Kalamazoo. I'm kind of surprised Kalamazoo County doesn't have it, because I know they used to have a pair in Kalamazoo. So that may not be a complete showing of counties. Whereas I know in the UP, there are both, it's more of a mixture of artificial nests and natural cliff sites that are being used.
Thank you.
Yeah. And, you know, interesting story about the Houghton nest. It was really, you can see MDOT is one of the sponsors, and then there was the DNR as well as Copper Country Audubon. But part of the original impetus for putting that nest box out there was DOT was really interested in controlling pigeon populations that and their droppings were sort of accelerating the oxidation of the bridge steel and damaging the paint. So they were more interested in using peregrines as a deterrent, and it really has worked very effectively. The pigeon population declined and they kind of moved away from the bridge largely. But we have a webcam that is on those birds during the breeding season. So you can tune in from anywhere in the world 24 hours a day and watch what's going on in that peregrine nest. And somebody asked about bald eagles, and this is this is showing you a similar kind of recovery. Bald eagles never disappeared entirely from Michigan, but back in 1978, it was they were relatively rare, and you can see the distribution of bald eagle nests and territories in 2017 and how dramatically that has changed. And I can show you also for Wisconsin a very similar data for bald eagles. They were down in 1974 to just that northern lakes area of northern Wisconsin, and where they've really like saturated the area now, and then moved up into the Apostle Islands and along the Mississippi River. So bald eagles is another, you know, wonderful success story in conservation, in bird conservation in our area and beyond. And that was the key to that, to some degree, was it wasn't just a single factor, because there is some poaching of peregrine falcons, and there's some poaching of bald eagles, and there's lead poisoning that bald eagles get into with fishing lures and things like that. So there are other things affecting bald eagle. There's habitat loss and changes in fish populations and things like that. But DDT was just such a powerful, overwhelming negative force on their ability to reproduce that once that was removed, it really freed their population to recover. And not all population declines can be addressed quite that simply as it was in the case of those birds. And this was true for brown pelicans and a number of ospreys, a number of other species too. So just to summarize, those top predators they suffered because of DDT. It was mostly reproductive failure. And I already mentioned the reintroduction program and increasing the carrying capacity of the landscape by adding nest boxes. And I don't know if this is still true, but I have heard that New York City had, at least some years ago, had the highest density nesting of peregrines anywhere in the world. So they're very adaptable. That's another nice characteristic of peregrine falcons is they're happy to eat pigeons and starlings and a number of others, like very abundant urban birds. Any questions about that before I kind of shift gears a little bit? Okay. Well, let's think, I guess in those cases, what we've talked about in those couple of examples is effects on reproductive success. But population biologists sometimes boil down the sort of the demography of a species being sort of positively affected and added to by birth and immigration, sort of individuals moving into a population, and then subtracted through death and emigration, emigration being the movement of individuals out of a certain location. So these are sometimes abbreviated, these BIDE factors: birth, immigration, death, and emigration. And so over time, it's really the kind of the push and pull and rise and fall of these factors that cause populations to grow or shrink or remain stable. And the forces that affect those for different bird species are often quite diverse, and they're complicated, and they're mostly poorly understood for most bird species, although better understood for some species than others. And I mentioned earlier where species are migratory, the forces that affect their birth and death rates and the kind of the movement of birds into and out of populations becomes even a little bit more difficult to understand, because birds are moving from, well, like those catbirds that we mentioned earlier, moving from the UP to Mexican humid forest every year, and all kinds of things in between as they migrate. So bird populations rise and fall within some natural boundaries as a result of things like insect outbreaks. And I just mentioned the yellow-billed cuckoo because I saw the first yellow-billed cuckoo I've seen in well over a decade, just a few weeks ago. And there's my sense is, based on posting, that people have been seeing more yellow-billed cuckoos this summer than usual. Does anyone want to back me up on that?
Yes.
Anyone in the audience here?
Yep.
Yeah. Kind of a shy, retiring bird that you don't see that often, and they just seem to be showing up on postings more. And I haven't looked on eBird to see if there's really evidence behind this, but. And one of the things that affects cuckoo populations is forest tent caterpillars and other outbreaks, sort of periodic outbreaks of superabundant insects. And there was some of that in the Great Lakes this year. On the lower, northern lower, I saw when I was driving through there this summer, some big defoliation from insects. So insect outbreaks, where you have a superabundant food source that kind of leads to a really good reproductive year that leads to a surplus or a pulse of individuals. Disease outbreaks can have the opposite effect. House finches are sort of famous for their contraction and spreading of avian pox, which seemed like a problem, sort of a pandemic for birds that they have to deal with with diseases as well as we are dealing with it. You have sort of inherent fecundity. So what is sort of the ability of a bird to reproduce under the best of conditions? Birds have sort of a limited, they lay a certain number of eggs and they can nest a certain number of times per breeding season. And some of those are relatively fixed. And then you have climate cycles like El Nino, and then gradual change related to anthropogenic climate change and other changes in the environment. And I list a whole bunch. I won't go through all those, but these are anthropogenic forces that kind of overlay the kind of the forces that these bird species have evolved with for many eons in our area. So human beings bring along our activities, and there might be somebody in the waiting room waiting to get in. I don't know if somebody can let them in there. And the big ones here that we know just from recent research are outdoor cats, window collisions, but there are many other things that can have negative effects on birds, but also positive effects. And I'll talk about those too. We mentioned cardinals being positively affected by bird feeding. So let's, so there was a paper that was published last year that some of you probably are aware of, that was really the first really thorough systematic analysis of long-term bird population trends in North America. And this was published in the very prestigious journal Science by Ken Rosenberg and his co-authors. And I just have a couple slides related to that, but a couple of the take-home messages from this was that we've lost a lot of birds in North America since 1970. Almost 30% of the total birds, individual birds that would have been around in 1970 are not around. And that doesn't mean that all the birds that were alive in 1970 have died. It simply means that when you go to a grassland or a forest, there's about 30% fewer birds in the trees and in the bushes and in the grasslands than someone going into those same habitats would have seen in 1970. And that's pretty alarming, and is a call to action, to conservation action to try to address it. Those declines haven't been felt uniformly across birds, however, and you can see in that middle graph here that it's grassland birds, boreal forest birds that have really suffered among the biggest losses. So what this is showing you here is change since 1970. So what you can see is wetland birds have actually done a little bit better because they're on the right side of this vertical axis here at 0. So they've actually increased, but most bird species have declined, and the ones that have declined the most are the ones with the longest bars on the bottom here: grassland birds, boreal birds, western forest. So those are habitat groupings where the biggest population changes, declines have been noticed. And then just one other slide, and there's a lot going on here, but let me see if I can just give you a couple take homes. This is breaking birds down by groups, by sparrows, wood warblers, blackbirds, and showing you the of the 3.2 billion birds that have been lost, that sort of almost 30% of birds that I mentioned in the last slide. Sparrows account for over a quarter of those. Wood warblers are another big group that has declined. And then a number of other birds, blackbirds, old world sparrows, which means even house sparrows, the lowly house sparrow, which most people don't worry about very much, has really suffered a lot, which is kind of curious and maybe a little bit surprising. And then there's our swallows, nightjars, and swifts, those aerial insectivores that I'll talk about in a moment, just a little bit more. So something seems to be going on with them, in addition to what's affecting wood warblers and sparrows. Now, it's not all bad news. We have things like raptors, waterfowl, and then curiously, vireos seem to not be suffering the way you might expect, given how similar they are to wood warblers in the foods they eat. the habitats they breed in. So I haven't heard a good explanation why vireos have done relatively well while warblers have done poor. But if anyone has any theories on that, I think that's a puzzle that people are trying to understand. Probably the improvements in waterfowl populations have to do with just the focus on wetland improvements and management for waterfowl and wetland species, but many waterfowl are game species, so they have a constituency out there and with resources to put toward their management and helping their populations grow. So those are some big trends in North American avifauna that were identified in this recent paper that got a lot of attention, and I'm sure many of you saw that paper or a lot of the press that came out of it. So we talked about peregrine falcons and a few other species. Somebody mentioned northern cardinals, and I want to run through just a few examples here and sort of what we think is responsible for some of these changes. Lawrence Binford was a professor at Louisiana State University, but he wrote a book called The Birds of the Keweenaw. So some of what I'm going to present here came out of that book. And he lists cardinals as historically absent in the UP. So that's just another piece of evidence that they just were never in the UP until relatively recent time. They're one of these sort of human commensal species. So often we think about like human development and human land use change as being like a complete negative impact on biodiversity, but there are species that are favored by human related changes to the landscape. And cardinals are one of them, not that they like every Walmart parking lot, but they certainly like residential development and sort of the mixed habitats that humans tend to create in places where they live. And they like bird feeders as well. And I was talking to Joe Youngman, who contributed a little bit to this talk if we get to the trumpeter swan section here. And he told me that back in the day when they were starting the Christmas bird count around here, that if you found a cardinal back in 2000, it was like a big deal and everybody was patting you on the back. And he said, in recent years, if you don't get a cardinal, if somebody doesn't get a cardinal on the Christmas bird count, you're in the doghouse. So that's an anecdote, but it's there's a lot of those that support this big change in cardinal numbers, positive change in cardinal numbers in the UP. So, and again, feel free to just jump in here if you have any questions. What I'm showing you here is a breeding bird survey data and Christmas bird count data, showing you the summer abundance of cardinals. And you can see they're very common in the Southeast, and their density kind of like tapers off, almost disappearing as they get into the UP. So we're just in that sort of palish pink, low density cardinal area. And also the percent change per year. So things that are in blue on the right here are areas where the population is growing and they're expanding. And so you can see the cardinals are a little bit of red, that's where they're declining, but most of they seem to be moving to the north and doing very well in Wisconsin and Southern Ontario and New York State. And they don't show them really in the UP there, but they probably will. UP will probably be blue in the next decade. So more evidence that of what we think we already know, that cardinals are moving into this area. And I just ran across this in Facebook today, and I just like stuck it in here because I thought it was kind of interesting. And I'll just give you a few seconds to read this. So a little bit of burning humor there with cardinals flying and becoming rare. And we often think about this with cardinals and blue jays, some really spectacular birds that we have in our area, but because they're relatively common, not that cardinals are that common in the UP, I think they're still notable here, but it's a call to appreciate the beauty of all of our birds, even if they are common. This is a really interesting tool that the Audubon Society has. Some of you may have seen this. If you go to audubon.org, you can look at projections and forecasts for many different species under several different climate change scenarios. So this is the +3 degrees centigrade. This is the most severe climate change scenario that you can select in this Audubon mechanism. And what you can see here is, if you look in this upper left, you can see that under that scenario, they gain about 31% habitat, which would not have been cardinal habitat up here that the modelers tell us will become more suitable to cardinals in time. A lot of their range is maintained, and they're not losing much except down in southern Texas and Florida. So that's a sort of a climate change projection for northern cardinals. Everything looks pretty rosy for northern cardinals. Let's look at another species where things aren't quite so positive from a population standpoint or a climate change standpoint. Many of you know golden-winged warblers have been a candidate species for listing under the Endangered Species Act. They have a narrow breeding range. And even within that, the habitats that they tend to favor are very narrow and specific. They have a large wintering range that is affected by a lot of different land use activities going on in Central America and even in parts of Northern South America. What happens in migration is relatively mysterious because they're, of course, dispersed over low density, crossing all kinds of habitats. And their breeding populations in different parts of North America show different trends. So if you look at this graph right here in the middle that I'm showing you, and let me expand that a little bit. This is the golden-winged warbler population declining, you can see sort of steadily, and then sort of stabilizing a little bit in the last 15 to 20 years, but big declines in the Appalachian population. So that's this orange belt down here. So they're really almost disappearing, golden-winged warblers are, from these areas. Meanwhile, the Minnesota population is growing, or is perhaps arguably growing or stable, but certainly doesn't seem to be declining. So this is sort of a good example of the complexity of understanding bird populations. They're not always behaving the same way in different parts of their range. And this is, did someone have a question? Okay. So that's just an example of sort of the complexity of golden-winged warblers. And this is that same graph, that same Audubon website showing you a forecast of a 3 degrees increase in temperature. And what you can see here is that would end up losing golden-winged warblers 100% of their range. All of their current range would no longer be suitable because of changes in the vegetation type that would be growing in those areas under that hotter, drier future. New habitat would be created, however, in these parts of Canada. The gray areas or the pale blue areas are 61% gain. Now, whether those would be colonized and whether that habitat would be suitable in time for golden-winged warblers to make that transition, that's a question. So this is an interesting tool that, if you're interested in looking at how climate change can affect different bird species in different ways, it's a very easy tool to investigate that. So under most climate change scenarios, there are a number of southern species that are predicted to move northward. Things like tufted titmice, hooded warblers, Acadian flycatchers, and northern mockingbirds, all of whom have ranges, breeding ranges, are what you're seeing here in the red, that are a little bit below the UP, and some of them even below the lower peninsula. But many of these species may be moving northward. And I think there's pretty good evidence northern mockingbirds are definitely already doing this. Tufted titmice, I'm not sure, although I do see, I'm starting to see the observations of titmice in the UP, which might be some evidence that they're beginning to sort of explore further to the north. So to the extent that those that habitat is will be suitable for those some of those birds, they may just be added to our breeding bird surveys and some of our Christmas counts here in the UP in another few decades. Probably more alarming are species whose range just barely comes down into the UP, but is mostly up into Canada. So these are things like Swainson's thrushes, magnolia warblers, palm warblers, and yellow-bellied flycatchers, all of whom have these ranges that just kind of reach down into the upper Great Lakes. And if their populations were to move north, we could lose them from our UP avifauna, breeding avifauna, which would be unfortunate. So one of the things driving this is changes in vegetation that support birds, or that birds are adapted for or choose to breed within. And one of these vegetation types that we have just a little bit of here in the UP is spruce fir forests. And what you see here on the left is the extent of current spruce fir in blue. And then if you see on the right, spruce fir is still in blue, but you don't see any spruce fir anymore in Maine and in the UP because in a lot of climate change scenarios, it's predicted that those species won't survive. And so birds like yellow-bellied flycatchers and palm warblers and blackpoll warblers who like spruce fir forests are likely to disappear with those forests from the United States. Not to say they wouldn't be able to persist in parts of Canada, but that's a question. So so if we go back a little bit further to 1800, what were the main ways that humans influenced bird populations? Well, prior to hunting regulation, trumpeter swans and other waterfowl were hunted, sandhill cranes, turkeys, and ruffed grouse. And a lot of raptors were either hunted or poached beyond what the population could sustain. So their populations declined in some cases to local extirpation because of the lack of any sort of restraint on hunting. Logging and agriculture and wetland destruction also contributed to a lot of population declines starting in the 17 to 1800s. And then you have the introduction of these novel environmental hazards like windows and outdoor cats and towers, and these sort of additional hazards that humans are placed and increasingly continue to add to the landscape that some birds are not well adapted to. So if we look at sort of historic changes, there were a number of species that actually really benefited from the cutover. If you go back to the mid 1800s and just late 1800s, you could find sharp-tailed grouse and greater prairie chickens, a lot of upland sandpipers and killdeer. So a lot of these prairie species sort of moved into the kind of the post-logging, post-fire prairie-like environment that existed for a few decades in the UP after logging happened. And so there are some grassland bird declines in the UP that are probably were a return to sort of pre-cutting densities. Certainly sharp-tailed grouse and greater prairie chickens were probably never really going to persist without really intensive management in most of the UP, although we do have some sharp-tailed grouse still in a few parts of the UP in Seney and I know over in Rudyard, over in that area. The purple martin is a really interesting case. It's one of those aerial insectivores, so it kind of falls into that group that we see a broad decline within insect gleaning birds, but it's not really well understood. And just in relatively recent time, this is the Michigan Bird Atlas data showing, and you can see right away just a real withdrawal of purple martin bird observation records of any breeding status, confirmed, probable, or possible. They've all but disappeared from the Upper Peninsula. and they've really contracted from even the lower peninsula. So, and this is probably not due to people's martin houses falling over or being neglected. There seems to be something else going on with purple martin populations, and it may be changes in insect abundance. It may be something going on in South America where they overwinter. But that's kind of an alarming species level decline that if you happen to be in a place where, and this isn't really so viable in the UP, but if you happen to be in a place where you can put a martin house out in the lower peninsula, you can sort of take a step to try to help that species, which is obviously experiencing some problems right now. And this is another one of these mechanisms that may be behind some of these bird population declines. And this is just a sort of a worldwide perception that insect populations are suffering. And the evidence for this, I'm not an entomologist or even an insect ecologist, but this is on the right, on the left from Science Magazine, on the right from the New York Times, and then there's an Audubon's illustration of a whippoorwill chasing a cecropia moth. And the evidence for this comes from a few long-term surveys of insects, but also from a lot of anecdotes, including just simply stories of people's summer windshields not being nearly as needing to be cleaned nearly as often as they used to, or as they remember that they used to when they were younger. And certainly, and there's also some pretty good evidence for some nightjars, like the whippoorwill, that the average size of the insect that they're preying on has gone down over the last several decades. And they've done that by looking at some of the, I think they look at the isotopic signature in the tissues of those birds, and they can kind of trace it to what level they're feeding on within the insect trophic levels, and that they're feeding on smaller insects, which could contribute to more difficulty in survival and reproduction for that group. But that's just a few studies that show that. So that's not well understood, but I wanted to mention that. And this is a Minnesota data for the eastern whippoorwill, and you can see it looks almost like the golden wing warbler graph, where whippoorwill numbers have dropped by 2/3 or perhaps even more in terms of their sort of mean abundance on breeding bird survey tracks. Does anyone have a whippoorwill site near where they are that they've noticed any change in the last years?
David, I did have Lori mention that there's a new colony of purple martins established in Escanaba recently.
Yeah, and is that Joe Kaplan has had a big role in that?
I'm not sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I know Joe a little bit, and I know he's been working on trying to do some things in terms of like reducing the spraying by the city and the county, and then also just putting up, I think, some martin houses. So,
Yeah, on the insects made me thinking of my drive up here from North Carolina during the summer. 1,200 miles, and it was real noticeable. My windshield barely needed to be cleaned after 1,200 miles driving in the middle of the summer.
Yeah, I know, and I think if one or two people told me that, I would say, well, maybe your memory is like remembering that one really heavy insect infestation that your dad went through when they were younger. But Brian, this is I think these stories, they come from Europe, they come from North America, and they're so widespread. I think there's definitely something going on in a lot of places with a lot of insect populations.
And Lori said, yes, you're correct about the purple martins, the guy that you mentioned.
Yeah, Joe Kaplan.
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in purple martins, Joe would be the first person I would talk to, especially here in the UP, where getting them to nest successfully takes some work, because obviously they're in a trajectory right now where they're not expanding, they're actually contracting. But He probably has some ideas about ways that you could try to entice them to return, which I hope we do. I mean, if you drive around Marquette, you drive around anywhere in the UP, you see marten houses all over the place. People used to put these out. They were one of the best like biting insect control mechanisms before we had zapping lights, electrifying lights and all those kinds of things. People would put these in their yards to control biting insects, and but you know, they're all empty now, and that's too bad. So let me, I think I'm getting kind of close to the end, and I've got some more things, but I don't, let me just finish with a couple of slides because I want to leave some time in case people have questions. This is just a couple slides on from Lori Binford's book on 91 species that have increased or decreased since historic times. And of course here, the mourning dove is one. And I've talked to old timers here in the Keweenaw that used to say, gosh, when I was a kid, if you saw a mourning dove, it was like a really big deal back in the early 1900s. And now, of course, it's not a big deal at all. They're very common. I'll just finish with this slide and the one that follows it. Other than the cardinal and I guess the mourning dove, and this is actually from Lori Binford's repeated surveys and from his book. If you had to name another species or two whose most of their distribution is to the south, who've become more abundant in Marquette or in the Keweenaw area, do you have some species that come to mind? And I've inserted a silhouette there. That's a bit of a clue.
Turkey vulture.
Yep, turkey vulture for sure. Has gotten much more abundant even in the 20 years that I've been in the UP.
I think somebody was chasing a black vulture last month somewhere.
Yeah, and you know, that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see if black vultures, I don't know if they're kind of following turkey vultures north. They're a heavier vulture. They need stronger thermals to really forage successfully, or at least that's the belief. That's what really keeps them in the southern US. But if it's climate change and more hot days in the summer, allowing turkey vultures to hunt more successfully, not hunt, but scavenge more successfully, you'd think that that would also mean black vultures are kind of like right on their heels coming behind.
I've got a few from Facebook. Ryan says house wren and Jude said turkey.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I don't have house wren in here, but I would agree that this is from Lori Binford's book, and these are the species that he documented had increased in the last say 50 to 60 years, whose primary distribution is to the south of us. And I would say I would add, you know, Binford didn't have house wrens on there, but I would say house wrens, I hear them more often now than I think I used to. That's an anecdote, but it does seem that way. Wild turkeys, you see, and what I've done is added what Binford suggested were the mechanisms: climate change, he said, and then also human feeding. Species with an asterisk are species whose expansion into the Keweenaw anyway, and really into the UP, has been aided by those factors at least. So there's, I think at this point, since it's a little bit after 8, I should probably stop and ask if people have any questions about anything I've talked about, or any questions about things that I didn't get to cover.
I have a question, Dr. Flaspohler.
Yeah.
You know, the scenario under a 3-degree centigrade increase, and I think that's a global average. If, you know, that's sort of all efforts right now are to try to keep the global increased temperature at 1.5 degrees centigrade, and 2 degrees centigrade is considered really, we're in deep trouble. If it goes to 3 degrees centigrade increase in global average temperature, even though there may be some new habitats that open up for birds that are currently restricted farther south, do you think there could be other factors that come into play that are going to have other deleterious effects on bird populations?
Yeah, I would say certainly that's what I showed you was a pretty simple model of changes under those different climate scenarios. And certainly you're going to have changes in predator and prey and parasite and perhaps disease transmission that will all come along with those temperature changes and precipitation changes. So it's not, I think maybe what you're suggesting and what I would totally support is that as temperature gets warmer, there isn't just the ability for everything to just kind of move up into like cooler Canada and find something just as suitable as where they left, because there are a lot of other variables that will change. And that's just sort of the kind of the ecosystem level changes. It's not even taking into account, that things like human agriculture might move from one location to the other and find it more suitable to clear parts of Canada for growing wheat and oats instead of North Dakota or wherever they are. So yeah, that's, I think there's a lot of things that go into what that would mean for our birds. You can actually go in and do, I think they have, for most species, they have a 1.5 degree, a 2 degree, and a 3 degree option that you can select and look at the outcomes. So good point. Thanks, Jeff. I see there's a chat too here. Increasing cormorant population. Yeah, I didn't even talk about cormorants, but they get a lot of attention because they're big and conspicuous, because people that lived here in the UP back in the 50s and 60s, they were rare, almost not even present. And then, especially in the lower Great Lakes, they've really expanded populations in Ontario and Erie, lower Huron, to the point where they're treated as competitors with recreational fishermen, and they're actually euthanized by the thousands by the Canadians and by American wildlife management agencies. Yeah, the cormorant, we could probably spend like another hour talking about cormorants. So they never get, because of the low productivity of Lake Superior, we see cormorants, they're around here, but they just never really have taken off the way they have in those lower Great Lakes. And I think that's probably mostly at the water's cold. The fish are down deep. There just aren't yellow perch and alewife populations up here to support them. But I think there's evidence they were a Great Lakes, certainly a Great Lakes bird, but probably pretty rare until rainbow smelt and alewives, and the human beings kind of changed the Great Lakes ecosystem in a way that really favored cormorants. So if we have a lot of cormorants, it's kind of our fault. But and the other thing that I guess I would say in defense of cormorants too, although this probably isn't like super popular, is fishermen are always quick to blame somebody else for some decline in their ability to catch fish. And whether it's cormorants or some other factor, and there are a lot of things going on in the Great Lakes, a lot of invasive species, a lot of changes in the what goes into the Great Lakes. And so Cormorants tend to get blamed, I think, kind of on a probably for some things that they're not really responsible for.
Well, I know whenever I don't catch fish, I'm looking to blame somebody else.
Yeah, yeah. Well, blame it on those European starlings. I'm sure they have something to do with it. Okay, I'm looking at the, okay, cormorants, thank you. I seem to be out offshore. I think that's comments about cormorants, perhaps. But let me see if anyone have any other questions, bird questions they want to verbalize.
Just an observation, now that I'm up here from North Carolina, I spent a lot of time on the coast down there with shorebirds, and there's so many people on the North Carolina coast now. Shorebirds don't have any room. If they're a beach bird,
Yeah,
they get chased off the beach. And I see the same thing up here now. It's even though it's more isolated beaches up here, even, I mean, the shorebirds here in Marquette, if they land on the Dead River Delta, there's somebody who walks a Great Dane out there every morning. So the
Yeah.
shorebirds, if they landed there, they're going to get chased off every single morning and have to move on. And I can see that happening all along the coastline up here as well. The shorebirds just don't have a chance to rest.
yeah. Do you guys have sewage ponds or other sort of more inland sites that are less disturbed by people?
Nothing as good as the Calumet sewage lagoons.
Oh, yeah.
We've got most of our lagoons are steeper edged,
Okay.
not drawn down as frequently, and a lot of times they line the rocks with the edges with rocks.
Yeah.
And, so there's not much in the way of feeding habitat around most of our sewage lagoons, at least in Alger County. And you know, and Brian is right. It's the same thing in Alger County. The mouth of the Autrain River used to be really good. I've been surveying there almost every morning at dawn during the shorebird migrations for the last 18, 19 years.
Yeah.
And the amount of, you know, the Pure Michigan campaign is one of my, like the fishermen blaming the cormorants. I blame the Pure Michigan campaign for what's happened to the increase in tourism at the mouth of the Autrain. Because they're just, the shorebirds are just chased out of there constantly. Numbers go down every year.
Just because of like human and dog disturbance?
I think that's a key factor, but it's hard to tell because shorebird numbers are down so much to begin with, and we get such a small percentage of them in the UP. It might not take much of a decrease for it really shows up here as well, but the tourism is just way up from what it used to be along the beaches and during the early morning hours and during the day.
Scott, have you noticed any difference in with COVID of like the beaches being less used, or is it like, are they more used now because of that?
I think more. I think a lot more local travel. So they seem to be used pretty frequently, and at least in Alger County, we've got a lack of basically hotels for the amount of tourism we get. So you get a lot of people, not a lot, but you get people basically camping in the zones where there's no overnight camping signs. They don't pay attention to it, and also even sleeping on the beach, that type of thing with their dogs. It's not just run rampant with people, but it's like Brian was saying, it doesn't take many people to scare off a shorebird.
Yeah. Well, and I noticed there's places on the Keweenaw that with the high Lake Superior water levels that used to have sand beaches that just don't, there's no habitat there anymore, or it's much less than it used to be. So that's another thing that's probably exacerbating, just changing the amount of habitat that's there, plus the disturbance. I had heard some people out east talking about piping plovers doing better in the Northeast because of the lack of tourism in some places there, but I don't know. I don't know if that's, doesn't sound like that's what's happening where you are. Any other questions? I've kept you all well beyond the hour here, but I'm not in a hurry to go anywhere, so I'm fine to keep chatting.
I was thinking about the vireos doing better than warblers. And
Yeah.
I know they have very similar habitat up here, but I was wondering about their overwintering areas. Maybe the warbler overwintering areas are taking a bigger hit than where vireos go. So do you know if they go to very similar places when they migrate, or maybe there's a difference that accounts for the difference in sickness?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm surely those guys must have been the Cornell group that put that paper together must have been right on top of that in the beginning, and because that's so surprising. And when I was putting this talk together, I kept thinking, oh, I got to Google, like, why are vireos not doing as badly as warblers? But I haven't done it yet.
Mm.
But it is really curious because I don't think anyone ever really separated those either in terms of their wintering ground or their breeding ground or their foods they eat. Yeah, I mean, red-eyed vireos, what would be interesting to see is like how much of that vireo piece of pie is really red-eyed vireos, that one species that's just so widespread and abundant. And if that one species does well, is it like carrying all the other vireos with it? Or I haven't looked into that in more detail, but it's surprising.
Thank
To
you.
me, it almost like reinforces the reality of what's happening to everything else, because like if everything's declining without exception, you start to think, well, maybe there's some sort of artifact of the way the data is being collected, or that just like biases it in that direction. But when you see like an exception like a vireo, to me that not alone, but that gives more credibility to the overall result, that it can pick up increases, it can pick up decreases, but what it's getting mostly is decreases.
Mhm.
Somebody just came in the waiting room, so hopefully they didn't think the talk was starting at 8:15.
Yeah, that was Jude. She just came over from Facebook. Ryan had a statement. I believe it's Ryan Rutherford.
Yeah,
Yeah, he said we survey white pine tailing area. Is that right? For shorebirds in Ontonagon County. My wife's helping me pronounce the Yooper stuff. Miles of great artificial habitat, but still great number of shorebirds up there.
still a great number.
Of shorebirds up there, yes.
Okay,
Not many people up there either, coincidentally.
yeah. I've flown over that white pine tailings area because it's kind of a weird color, I think, when you fly over it, but is it, oh, Ryan's not on there. I was just always wondered at like how polluted that was, or maybe it's not polluted and maybe it's just fine.
Yeah, he's on Facebook. There's a 20-second delay, so I'll see if
Yeah.
he's back here in a minute.
Probably can't have a conversation really there.
It'd be difficult.
Yeah. Well, the other really positive conservation success story was the trumpeter swan, and I was going to talk about that, but I didn't have time. But that's one that went from not being a UP bird at all, and in fact, not even being in the Midwest until the 80s and the 90s, to being quite an abundant bird now. There were 20 some or so nests in Keweenaw and Houghton County and Baraga County just this last summer. And many over in Seney. You guys have driven through Seney probably, and you see trumpeter swans everywhere. I think they have an average of 32 nests every summer, last several summers, 250 or so birds there. So the trumpeter swan has been a tremendous success story of bringing that bird back from being extirpated in 1900 to being a really healthy, relatively common bird.
Down where I bird in North Carolina, where I live, they were never seen during the winter time until about 2 years ago. And then people started seeing them. They started showing up. It was a great sight.
Yeah. What was really interesting is I teach ornithology, and I always, and I never really looked at the size of a tundra swan versus a trumpeter, because, they look kind of alike. And when they're flying over, you can identify them kind of by the size of the flock sometimes. But tundras are like half the size, average half the size of a trumpeter. So they're, even though we think of them as kind of two big white swans that look quite a lot alike, Trumpeters are much, much bigger.
Ryan did come back. He said they had high levels of chloride in the past, but not really polluted up there anymore.
Okay, well, that's good news.
One of the success stories that we've noticed in Western UP is wild turkeys.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that too, and that's
They're
been
just
10 years
everywhere.
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in Western Gogebic County, Watersmeet,
Yeah,
everywhere.
Everywhere.
they're way out on the tip of the Keweenaw. You see
Well,
them?
Really?
then the wild turkeys are even, you can see them in through northern Wisconsin.
Yeah,
They're just everywhere. They have just blossomed.
yeah, and I think initially a lot of them were really dependent on like corn feeders and supplemental feeding in the winter, but I've seen them in places that I don't think they're a long way from what, at least what I could see, seems to be any kind of like natural or human feeding. So I don't know. The dogma was always like they can't live through deep snow. They can't feed
Right.
in deep snow. And I don't know if either like these guys have figured it out or there's more feeding than we realize, or exactly what's making them thrive so well.
I don't know what natural predation attacks them either, because they seem to produce huge
Broods.
Huge broods. They're just everywhere. They're all along the roads, and you really
On the
just
paths in the woods.
right. You can't miss them.
Yeah.
And 20 years ago, when we first came up, we hardly saw them at all.
Right.
We saw them down in Illinois.
They were non-existent.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think there's very little records of turkeys ever being in the UP prior to, well,
Really?
10, 15 years ago.
Wow.
Maybe in the southern UP, but certainly not in the northern half of the UP. And I never saw one until about 10 years ago. And now, as you said, they're everywhere.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
and
thank you.
Coyotes would eat them. Certainly, opportunistic wolf would eat one, bobcats, foxes. But turkeys are pretty tough, and they've got great eyesight, and they're very wary. So, as delicious as they are at Thanksgiving, I think they're not that easy to catch.
That's right.
They seem to have like figured out the persistence. It'd be interesting if we get like a really, really tough winter to see if we see that really not.
Mhm.
Well, last winter, if you're talking about snow cover, last winter was really tough.
Yeah.
Because we had an awful lot of snow around Watersmeet.
Yeah.
Well, David, I'm sure the wild turkey is another real conservation success story. It's been in large part due to state DNRs and state game management agencies that have helped bring them back. And now the only states that don't have wild turkeys are Hawaii and Alaska.
Really?
Mhm.
That's
Well,
amazing.
I've seen wild turkeys in Hawaii. I think they are actually now in Hawaii, so maybe it's just Alaska.
Oh, okay.
Somebody released them there.
It had to be.
Yeah, Hawaii's got all kinds of crazy
Yeah.
game birds that have been released there. But
Right.
yeah, they were pretty much extirpated from Michigan and Wisconsin. I don't know if every last turkey was killed, but back in those early hunting days, yeah, humans are pretty good at like wiping out every last one. If we
Yeah.
really
Yeah, but,
revenge it.
hunting is in the decline. At least that's what the
Yeah,
DNR says.
yeah,
There just aren't that many people that go out and hunt anymore.
yeah. That's true for deer hunting. I think it's probably true for turkey hunting too.
I know in my particular case, if I don't get my meat on a plastic tray, I don't know what to do with it.
Well, I think you have a lot of company there. True.
David, thank you for inviting Copper Country. I know we only got it at the last minute, but it was a really good program and we really appreciate being able to be here.
Oh, well, thanks. Thanks for coming. And I may give this as a similar talk to the local.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, give them a little more notice.
Yeah, 30 minutes isn't enough.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
there other questions?
David, I have a question from Cherie. Has the introduction of wolves, the success of the wolf population, what effect has it had on bird habitat populations and levels, and any particular species that the increase in wolves has affected negatively or positively?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know one real positive effect have been ravens, and I think probably any scavenging bird, particularly in the winter, and that includes chickadees and nuthatches. All those birds will eat, blue jays, crows. They will eat at wolf kill sites, and the fat and the meat that the wolves don't take.
The only bird I can think of, that would be affected might be ruffed grouse.
Maybe negatively affected.
Yes.
Yeah, that's possible. Like, could a wolf kill a ruffed grouse, catch it and kill it? I'm sure they would try if they could. I kind of doubt that there's much of that though, because grouse are hard to catch and wolves are not really looking for that. I don't think
That kind of
as
catch.
a common
Mhm.
prey. I don't think they would have much effect on many birds. I'm sure that there's incidental, wolves occasionally taking a sandhill crane or a Canada goose or things like that, but
Mhm.
probably mostly positive in terms of that scavenger community. I know there's a pretty tight relationship between wolves and ravens in a lot of their range, and
Yeah,
to the
that's
point
true.
where
I
some
see ravens and eagles on the road.
yeah, oh, and eagles too. That's I'm glad you mentioned
Yep,
that.
eagles.
For sure. Yeah, and even like turkey vultures, I think any scavenger, as long as you can keep from getting eaten by a wolf, like coyotes.
Or hit by a car.
Or hit by a car.
I think the cars have caused as much scavenger activity from
Yeah,
roadkill.
I mentioned climate change for turkey vultures, but there isn't a lot of good data on like roadkill abundance, but more roadkill in the landscape, you're going to get more scavengers, and they're going to do better and reproduce more. Yeah.
It's an interesting world out there.
Yeah, interesting and getting more interesting, for better or for worse.
Yes, yes. Ready to go?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
it's my pleasure. Thank you guys for coming. It's nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
David, thank you.
David, before everybody leaves, I just want to say that was an excellent, excellent presentation. Thank you very much for doing that.
Oh, my pleasure.
And also I wanted to thank Brian Murphy for, setting up all the technical requirements for this, both on Facebook and Zoom. This was our first virtual meeting that we've had in our chapter. And I think it came off really well. Also, thanks to Ann Joyle for getting the word out to everybody about the meeting. And I also wanted to mention that we're thinking about doing a virtual members meeting next month in November. And that's a meeting where traditionally we ask members to bring in their photos and share them with everybody. So I'd like to know from folks, not right now necessarily, but I'd like to know if our members would be interested in doing that next month. And if so, you can email your photos to Brian. And his email is brianmnc52@gmail.com. And Brian, could they also message those on Facebook?
They can do it. And yeah, pretty much any way they want. Email, message me, send me a link. Whatever's good for
Okay.
them.
Okay.
Yep.
So thanks again, Dr. Flaspohler. That was really, really interesting.
Yeah, my pleasure. And maybe in a future year, we could share more about the trumpeter swan story, because that's a really inspiring one. And I just ended with a couple pictures of swans and then a silly banana swan there to go out. Right.
That's
Yeah.
question.
That would be great. We would love that.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Hey, thanks for coming, everybody.
Very good.